I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory. I am on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people hosting our Tradecraft Week. And we acknowledge and respect them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of this land. And I see we have Zofia who has joined us as well. So for the benefit, I mean, I won't do a sort of a formal introduction of Michel. I will let you tell them about your credentials and so on, which are many. But I will say that Michel has become a good friend of mine and of Kim's, working with us on our restructuring and our governance issues, management issues at PAFSO. As we've been going through the what the full-time presidency means for the organization, he has really helped us in addressing how it really works. I mean, now, we felt like we had a reasonable hope of the full-time presidency passing and becoming a permanent part of our structure. But I have to admit that we had not really thought through. I mean, I thought we knew, after having worked for 3 years on a pilot basis, I thought, okay, we know how this will work. And Michel has really helped us by helping us think through, well, no, in fact, when you make it permanent, this is going to have all kinds of other sets of implications, and really helped us in identifying, some of the different stakes that were at play and so on. And so, I mean, I personally have found his leadership advice very, very useful. Il est complètement bilingue. Alors, vous pouvez poser des questions et faire des interventions dans la langue de votre choix. I will not torture you with my French too often, but we will let him do that. And without further ado, I'll hand over to him to start telling you what you need to hear, because you've heard from me enough today, most of you. Thanks, Michel.
Thanks a lot, Pamela. And I guess one of the big things that we're going to be going through tonight is looking at leadership as a management system and linking those things with quality of decisions, building teams, and how to organize teams. So a lot of the threads that we work through with PAFSO are actually accessible to all organizations, all teams, all units of all sizes. And so we'll be talking about that. Could you, Pam, host disabled participant screen sharing? Can you provide me with screen sharing rights, please?
Okay.
And I'll get the presentation going.
Oh, let's see. Sorry.
You should be able to do it now.
Yes, I can. Okay, great. And with that, we'll just get this going here and get with the presentation. I'm going to make this a little smaller here. And again, I'll depend on both Pamela and Marty for their voices if there's questions and comments as we go along. So in collaboration with PAFSO, this whole presentation was a roundtable / workshop on leadership. And you got to get into what is leadership, and we'll be defining some elements of that. I do see leadership as being something different, something that is accessible to all employees in all different locations within the organization. So again, it depends what you're looking at, but when you look at the element of inclusivity, everyone in a team plays a role. That role, when well played, is leadership. And we'll be looking at that in that different light. And I think when you redefine certain things, it starts resounding differently with different people. But we get into a lot of the synergies that are required for high performance teams, but high performance that is energizing and high performance that is sustainable. And these are things I think that we're discovering in 2021 onwards. And what's interesting with COVID is a lot of people I talked to had some time to be able to pull back, take stock, think actually, and be mindful of where they are, where they're going, and with that are making different choices. And in many cases, we can say that's also relates to quality of decision making. So that's how I define leadership. A little bit of my background really quickly, but I was extremely fortunate in the early years to be the first leadership trainee at Nortel. They provided me with my first job and said, go create value. And I wasn't really sure what that meant. And in a lot of cases, I started looking at what are some of the biggest problems facing organizations at that time. I guess I came out of school, I was 21 years old, and found that one of the hardest things for organizations is to actually replace women, executive women, management, women in management that were going on maternity leave, because the system and the laws have to protect a role, and yet you need somebody who has capability to take that place. And not just necessarily keep the role going, but help the organization move forward. So I actually used and leveraged that mechanism to find myself in various roles at a very early age that would have been probably somewhat inaccessible for a 21-year-old, and went through that program over 10 years, essentially creating all the roles. And I saw the organization go from 18,000 people to over 97,000 after I left. And it continued to grow into a company, I think, until about 136,000 employees, going from a Canadian corporation to a North American corporation to a global corporation. So saw a lot of change there. And then what I did is I went to Ernst & Young into corporate consulting, and essentially lived in a plane for a few years and realized that I had lived in a bubble for 10 years. And that bubble meant that Nortel had a culture of building good general managers. Part of that, to me, means asking hard questions, the right questions, creating value. I had been able to define what that meant. And I did it outside of human resources. I was with the process transformation and customer connections teams, which are related to sales and marketing. And there I went and saw the rest of the industry and did things with consumer goods, pulp and paper, banking, just corporations throughout the rest of the spectrum. Later on, then became an executive in human resources, and then did that for a couple organizations. One of them was BC Emergis, went from 300 employees to 3,000 in 18 months, about 12 acquisitions, divestitures, and restructurings. Hyperchip went from 30 to 650 employees in about 24 months. Again, a few acquisitions, but mostly organic. And then I started up my own company in 2002 and kept what I do really well, which is help organizations grow and structure themselves for sustainable growth. And it just, in a sense, throughout that period, started developing my own frameworks of management and leadership, collaborations with many different people around what their thoughts are, whether they're in industry, or outside of the industry, and found myself actually being a bridge builder between government, NGO, entrepreneurship, corporations, and others today. And that leads to, in the couple coming months, actually writing a leadership book with 4 other authors, a co-creation that actually leverages the model that I'll be presenting tonight, and should be ready for publication in fall of 2023. And there we have an eclectic group of people, a person who's an advisor to our Prime Minister, a person who's a general in charge of the leadership school for CAF, an engineer executive in complexity, a published author, a serial author that looked at Aboriginal challenges and issues from a settler's point of view, and myself. So these are things that help hopefully shape and try to package and describe things in a way that's useful. So I find this exercise tonight is another attempt at trying to do that. So I'd really would appreciate as well anyone who has feedback. My email is there, msalmon@lumosinc.com. Would greatly appreciate any feedback and constructive feedback in terms of improving this as I continue to try to build part of my career around these conferences, workshops, and leadership tools and events. One of the things that I tried to coin is enduring leadership. It's really around the sustainability of it's how do you help people perform at their top notch, we can call it high performance, without getting tired. It's the difference between, sometimes we say, running a marathon versus sprinting. If we sprint through life, we might get tired and not finish that marathon, we talk about burnout, we talk about stress, we talk about change increasing. And some of these elements you're going to see tonight are actually predictors of superior and sustainable performance, because they're not draining us of our energy, but actually energizing us. And it's one of the key elements that we can actually look at from a self perspective, from a team perspective, and from an organization perspective. So one thing tonight I'll be trying to walk through for each of you is take a look at the self element and also try to link it into the teams. There are two elements I think we can do fairly well in the time that we have to actually taste a little bit of it, put it in context for yourself, and actually be able to walk away tomorrow, next week, next month, putting some of these elements in practice and saying, hey, it actually works. It's actually simple enough that this is something I can access, and it can make a difference in how I'll approach certain things. So that's what this whole element of sustainability is about, is to make it real, make it simple, make it usable. I permitted myself a couple of quotes that I like. I've stolen these from Jim Barkdale, CEO at Netscape. But it comes down to one thing that Nortel, Ernst & Young, and many of my mentors showed me, is that you cannot manage with which you cannot measure. And that's an element of data-driven decisions, but not just data. We realize today that we actually have multiple brains in the body. We have one in our head, we have one in our heart, we have one in our gut, that they're interconnected. Neuroscience is actually proving that. But the second half of it is also when we don't have data, then it's somebody's opinion versus someone else's. So may as well use mine. So if there's any questions tonight as we go along, this is not about my opinions. I've tried to drive a lot of the presentation here through things that I've worked through the accelerators, entrepreneurial accelerators. We currently built with a team a leadership curriculum that goes with an entrepreneurial accelerator, and we take on 10 entrepreneurs, companies every 4 months, so 30 per year, and found that a lot of this stuff here works on the ground floor for them, for companies of 1, companies of 10, companies of 100, companies of 1,000. And I've lived in companies of 10,000 and more, and know that these methods work. The other part of it is time. There's a temporal element to our development. There's a temporal element to who we are. It changes over time. So the management of time is just as important as the management of money. The element of money comes into having a sustainable system. Whether you're an NGO, whether you're an association, you have to balance the budgets to be there tomorrow. So money is a big part of that equation around a healthy ecosystem. It takes money. Money is not the end point, but it is a tool that is absolutely required and necessary for a healthy ecosystem. And the decisions we make around money are basically capability, oftentimes buying labor and then pulling that labor together, which is people, which is us, essentially. One that comes from, and is often used by a great consulting friend of mine in the NRC, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Focus. Knowing where you're going, it starts there. Knowing your why are you doing something? Why is this organization going in this place? Why is this team doing what they're doing? And sometimes those are really hard questions to ask, but it starts linking into that fundamental raison d'être, and that element that essentially anchors back into a fundamental element of team performance, which is confidence. And then never mistake a clear view for a short distance. At some point, that sentence comes so true so many times. When you actually have a clear why and you know where you're going, the view can be very clear, but change can take months, years, lifetimes. And one of the things I learned, mostly through Nortel, but the echo after the years after Nortel, was the pace of change. You can only go as fast as the people and the teams and the units and the organization can go. And so it doesn't matter if you have one person who's a visionary on the team, if the people are not following, if the people are not engaging, or they take time to do so, that heavy lifting is an important part of the process. And I know with Pam, with PASO, we talked a lot about, timing these elements in a way that makes human sense, because things are going extremely fast. So again, the pace of change is really important to go with. And it's, you know, pulling people to do their best instead of pushing them into their best. Questions, comments?
We do not have any right now.
So leadership, another more fundamental. Chantal Jans is a PhD. She is actually a woman engineer out of France that I met. She's 72 years old today. Built Expert 5A framework and built her entire thesis around it, but also her life's work in consulting with top athletes and leaders, CEOs and leaders in organizations. Like a true scientist, she did a great life's work, but it wasn't necessarily known or adopted. It's probably something that should go more viral. But for her, the definition of leadership was taking charge and letting go at the same time. And you're going to see a lot in her system, because it is a system of leadership. Is that you're going to hear me talk about tensions, constructive tensions. This element of learning and evolving moves because of conflict, but good conflict, like stress. Good stress doesn't. All stresses are not necessarily bad. So it's a lot of dualities you're going to find in this model that are not contradictions of one another, but necessary dualities to make things move in a coherent way. And so we look at building individuals. We're faced with some of these dualities. We'll talk about a few of those later on. Teams are faced with them, and organizations are faced with them all the time. And they are really about, it's an act that requires us to be able to let go of what we know in order to move into the unknown. There's no way to make place if we hang on to what we know. This is the way we've always done things. If you've heard that sentence, that's actually a system dysfunction in an organization or a team, because it's the act of letting go is not presence. Now, we're not saying let go for anything, but there needs to be coherence when it's done. But we'll talk a little about those dualities there. But it's really this known, this unknown, this thing of progressing in a sane, organized, and I'll use the word organic, natural way. And a lot of these elements, you'll see that they're not foreign to us. We know the stuff instinctively in our guts. It's just by presenting it in a coherent pattern or in a coherent way, you'll see patterns. You go, oh yeah, look at that. Actually, I do that every day. Never saw it that way. And so if you take a few things out today, it'll be a few little nuggets like this around these elements that create what I call constructive conflict, ebbs and flows if you want, that moves you towards change, and change in a positive way that actually energizes you. And the other element around this taking charge and letting go is around autonomous leadership. And Chantal really talks about our own DNA, and many people are more into an automatic or automaton mode where, well, I've always done it this way because that's the way I'm geared. That's the way I am. The DNA defines you and your actions too. So we're more in reaction to the environment. We let the environment influence ourselves. We're often waiting for things to happen rather than provoking them. Versus autonomous, you might see your DNA as a starting point. We are who we are, yes, but we can choose to evolve. And there's a lot of new science coming out. A good scientific friend of mine in the neurosciences said, Michel, the bodies of knowledge in the last 10 years in neurosciences went from a couple, less than 100 articles to thousands today in 10 years. So it's like we're doing huge leaps and bounds in progress around understanding what that is. And we are able to reprogram our brains. There are books and scientists who talk about how to do that. We're not talking about quacks here. We're talking about scientists and have basically, peer reviewed and other elements that bring these new sciences to play. So we are in a very, very young science around what it means to be autonomous. So I don't mean to be an expert on this. I do mean to be hopefully an expert user and somebody who does a lot of testing on the ground with entrepreneurs, and we learn together in an accelerated mode. That I do all day long. So for me, the DNA is a starting point that characterizes you and gives you a solid foundation. It doesn't define who I'm gonna be, but it's a starting point. It also doesn't define who I have to be. The other element is that we want to influence our environment, our teams, organizations, communities, families, friends, a lot of elements there. And we can provoke possibilities. Doesn't mean we'll always attain them, but we can start shaping future. And this is where there's an element of collective intelligence that teams, units, and organizations can develop when we focus on the same things together. We can move mountains. And we'll talk about specific elements that help us do that. The automaton as well, it's often we're in survival mode or a survival dynamic to protect ourself that defines us. So it's actually resistance to change. You are in reaction. The word that we use in psychometrics is our pulsions. How we react to environment is actually measurable when we're not mindful. And we're pretty much programmed individuals. And we often seek to satisfy ourselves versus seek to harmonize elements within our system. The other thing is you follow an adaptive dynamic and aspire to update your non-self. So we at the individual level, we are a self moving towards a non-self. And there's this tension there that takes place all the time. And there's also a tension between ourselves and who our society thinks we are, our community, our friends, our families, how we grew up, our education, all these other factors that kind of create a box sometimes, and sometimes that box has a lid on it. So this ability sometimes to be able to step back and say, is this really who I am fundamentally? Is that what energizes me? Sometimes the answer is no, and it's not always a collective yes or no. There's elements that can energize, and that's what this last point is. You are energized by doing and going through a continuous learning process. So for me, university was a beginning of learning, just like many of the martial arts are beginning of a mastery process. And that's why I see leadership for me as a path, something that we strive to be better selves, that we have to work at every single day when we get up. And so it's not a light switch on and tomorrow you're baptized as a leader. Leadership is a process. And processes can be managed, they can be measured. And tonight you'll see a lot of elements that are measurable. Questions, comments? So the collective element is if we can individually focus, build our futures, we can collectively do it as well. And this is why at the team, unit, organization levels, we can consciously mobilize our collective intelligence in a sustainable manner is possible for organizations, and we'll be touching on how to do that. And it's one of the elements that we looked at within PASO at all levels. As we start looking at the structure, what is needed in order to, and one of the big elements was needing to define what that renewal looks like, what we can be, and then work and strive towards it. Doesn't mean you'll reach every single goal, but as we strive, we're going to learn more, adapt it. And that's why we can now have a clear vision with not necessarily all the elements attached on exactly how we're going to get there. And so part of it is also about leadership is dealing with uncertainty. So the journey ahead for the rest of the format is actually walking through some of the paces. So I tried to build this into a workshop that's going to be somewhat collaborative. So if you don't have pen and paper, you might want to have a little piece of pen and paper with you around, or something you can just write on for a few notes, because there'll be a little quiz there where I'll need you to take on just a few notes. So key success factors for all this, I really see that there's three prerequisites. The first one is what I call, the all-in category is one of the biggest challenges in leadership is walking the talk. And we see this in the news every day. We see this in corporations, NGOs, governments, when there's inconsistencies. And we'll walk through the model a little bit more detail, but when there's inconsistencies there, it mines confidence. And that confidence is the bedrock for performance and also shapes a lot of our mindset. So walking the talk is a big element, I believe, that is a prerequisite and a foundation and a cornerstone for ongoing leadership. And it's difficult to do, to be consistently walking that talk. And again, that's where I think we can strive to. I don't think it's possible to be perfect around it. So perfection doesn't exist in my book personally. I can strive to be perfect, but to achieve perfection is not a goal in itself. Striving for it is, because it's a continuous learning process. The second one is the why, understanding your why, your reason for being. And this is the same for yourself, for your team goals and organizations. The reasons for being might be different. And when you align them, when you start aligning a team goal and an organization goal with individuals, this is where there's a lot of opportunity here for creating performance, just by naturally creating that alignment between things. Also, too, when we don't see when it's alignment, I've got a lot of friends of mine in corporations and government and others where we talk about, and you can see they're not in that happy place. And in a lot of cases, you know, the first question is where are you going? And it's not clear. And then if you do have that of the problem addressed, then it's the how you're going to do it. Same with people, their late career. One of the things that I find as a commonality is often this why needs to be clarified. Sometimes people have an instinct of what it is, but haven't verbalized it. And one of the reasons for that, and you will see that in what we explain here, is that a lot of this element of alignment comes from the right brain. The right brain does not express itself in words. It expresses itself in emotion. And most of the psychometrics on the markets actually are measuring the left brain. Our schooling is left brain. Our mathematics is left brain. Engineering is left brain. Management is left brain. Exists, let's use the right brain. So Chantal often said, this whole process of leadership is about putting the left brain to the service of the right brain. And I just love that analogy, but it really comes down to really understanding and aligning your why. And when we do that with the entrepreneurs, it's magical. We have a 12-week boot camp, and we do that alignment week 1. It often takes them 3 to 4 weeks to get through the process, but the magic happens once that bolt is in place. And then the last one is impact. We all want results. And that's the measurement piece here. Measure the what and the how. And this comes out of a lot of testimonials of sexualization. We create value. And individuals, each of us have talents that create value in a certain way. The teams put together properly create value, and the organizations as well. And this is where I have a lot of fun, because this is how I guess, you know, I'm at the point in my career now where I help organizations really put together the people and processes to generate that value. And that's essentially, you know, when people ask me, what do? I build organizations through people.
Michel,
Questions, comment on this roadmap? Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So I'm just wondering if you have seen, you know, talking about people who are not happy and who are finding that they're not in alignment with their reason for being and so on. Are you seeing an increase in people facing that kind of crisis since COVID? Like, has COVID caused, do you think, like a shift? I mean, we're hearing a lot about, you know, the Great Resignation, yeah, about a lot of people really wanting to change things. I'm wondering if you're seeing that.
I am, but I don't think it's the nature that there's more of them. I think it's always been there. I think people are just more open to speak about it. So there's more of an openness. There's this massive prise of conscience, this massive taking on of consciousness, because people stayed home and got bored and took stock. And that's really the conversation that's happening, is that when people take stock, dangerous things happen to societies. They shift. They actually started clarifying their reasons for it. It's like, why am I doing this? And one of the articles that I read that was really fantastic on this subject was specifically around filling our schedule so much that we had a busy factor. So you don't have time to actually poke at those questions of, what do I want to do when I grow up? And you know, I'm a 55-year-old man, and I love still using that. It's find that little boy and little girl inside of you, and that starts drawing back into your why. And in a lot of cases, that was always there, but it got buried somewhere between first job and university and or college and kids and just life challenges and stuff like that. So oftentimes that gets buried. And when you remove the dust from it and give yourself time, so I think what happened is we have a collective consciousness awakening because people had time on their hands. There's different debates and discussions around, some of the government programs and whatnot gave opportunity to people to not go through a wave of stressors because they actually had subsistence revenue. And that's a lot of it that's related to the big quit, especially with the Burger King example in the US.
Yeah, no, and I think that a lot of people had a chance to see what's possible as well, right? In terms of what kind of flexibility they could have and still be able to get their main tasks done and things like that, and recognize that maybe a lot of the rigidity that we were seeing in normal corporate or government or, work life was not really necessary and not really serving anybody.
A personal example, COVID has been fortunate. I've been fortunate because of COVID to regain 40% of my life because I was spending time going from client to client in the same day, doing about 45,000 kilometers a year, which represents 2 to 4 hours in a car per day.
Wow.
Recuperated. So for me, and I don't do 9 to 5. So for me, this is almost an increase of bandwidth of 40%. I stuck that into leadership. It's funny because it was in February COVID hit. In March is when I actually produced my first leadership curriculum because I got bored. And I was looking at, I've got all this stuff over the last 30 years. What do I do with it? And then I made a few phone calls. And so for me, it's I can measure it. It's about 40%. And one of the biggest things is I was viewed as I would be viewed as a non-professional consultant or human resource professional if I wasn't interviewing people face to face, because that was a norm that was expected, just like showing up to the office. And so, yeah, again, all of a sudden COVID killed the expectations. You can't go to an office, you can't see the client, but all of a sudden your quality is as good or better. Your punctuality is as good or better. And I know of one organization in the government that just prior to COVID were about to cramp down on their employees with a very specific protocol for productivity because they were trying to increase productivity by 10%. COVID hit and the work at home, and naturally without any interventions, productivity went up about 12 to 15%. And when they analyzed it, they were going to make management decisions that were literally the opposite. People were looking and dying for the flexibility, and they were about to put the screws on. And wow. and so they would have got their 10%, but they wouldn't have got the energizing factor. And all of a sudden here, they're getting 12 to 15% with people that are energized. And it's funny because I talked to the DG and his director, specifically on that, and they abandoned the plans afterwards. But it's without COVID, the example would have never been allowed to take life.
Yeah, the theories, the COVID forced testing of a lot of theories that everybody had been resisting.
Yeah,
resisting getting a pilot on.
Yeah, there was a lot of smoke out there.
Yeah.
and we realized today as well is the management skills required to manage local in an office are very different, and the management skills in the physical workplace are the ones struggling the most because that's the way they did it. So those are the people who actually want things to go back the way they were. But there's enough evidence now that it doesn't have to be that way. But so COVID was an accelerator. It was a mass experiment. And chaos that forced us to reassess sometimes our priorities, but also reassess our assumptions. It's actually the summary of my last slide, which is take a look at your decision-making assumptions, please, and you will figure out a lot of things will come to light. but do it for the team, organization, and units. And wow, all of a sudden, we call that corporate culture, but a lot of those corporate cultures were based on, we're not based on facts, we're based on assumptions that were never tested or challenged, or allowed to be challenged.
Interesting, thanks. Listen, I don't want to divert you too much from your slides because we want to hear the rest.
No, but this is your questions are
your
questions are dead on. It's very much in that material. One of the things in terms, as we now shift from this model into the reality of it, one of the models that comes out is the 5 synergies of performance and mindset. And in order to get performance, we often in dysfunctional organizations will have, which is often linked with a lot of hierarchy and processes that are not necessarily serving the why, but serving individuals. And often that's why I call it the ecosystem, and our detriment to performance. And that it needs to be replaced, develop an ecosystem around what I call your distinctive competitive advantages. And every individual has some competitive advantages. Somebody hired you for a reason, obviously because you were their top choice. That thing is a competitive advantage for you. But you also have it for teams, organizations, societies, different economies have those competitive advantages. And it's actually putting it on the table and understanding what those are. But when you put every individual in their competitive advantage and collectively, you get a nice effect that takes place. It's like a clock. You take a clock apart and have all the components. It doesn't give time. Put it together and you get something more than itself. It actually gives time. Well, performance for teams is exactly that concept. It's like a clock. When performance teams auto-regulate themselves, they don't need management. The funny part is when we went to the to get our book published, one of the editors commented around, because they've obviously written a lot of books and with a lot of authors, but 5 authors trying to write a book, they're going, that's impossible. And interestingly enough, we can actually demonstrate through the use of this model how our 1 + 1 is greater than 2, and that our co-creation, each one of the authors individually would not have created what we are actually going to do together. But most often you talk to authors that try to write a book with 2, 3, 4 people, they'll say it's dysfunctional in most cases. We can actually map out that dysfunctionality where it's going to be. The other element is I go right to the bottom of that pyramid, which is really the base, or that iceberg, is trust. When trust is not there, you get difficulties in decision-making and passing the buck. When you get a functional organization, we're walking the talk and having transparency in decision-making. That in itself is a huge test, but it's the bedrock. And quite often when we take a look at organizations that aren't performing, you have to start there. And then we get into constructive friction. We'll look at what that means, but it can be the fear of conflict, essentially, a yes culture. And that needs to be brought into something that mobilizes your collective intelligence and in some degree requires vulnerability. And if you cannot have the vulnerability if the trust is not there. So now we're going to talk about, these elements are all interconnected. They're prerequisites for one another. So companies to be agile, to be innovative, to be able to deal with complexity in elegant ways, need to be able to deal with essentially this constructive friction or this conflict management, and how do we do it positively. And then that leads to engagement versus detachment, stress, and burnout. If we look at the number of cases Gartner had for corporate America, I believe the numbers were around 65% of people were on the verge of burnout or in burnout, which means 2 out of 3 people. That was pre-COVID numbers. And that comes with a complete detachment. And this is where a lot of that element of aligning goals around what energizes talents individually and then collectively works. And again, a lot of these elements are measurable. And then you talk to people, because I remember it was actually one lady from PAFSO who's on stress leave, spent 3 hours with her a couple months ago speaking. Not with PAFSO, with within the FS group, and was on stress leave. And the whole discussion was around, this element of engagement. And it came down to the slide that you just saw before is, where are you going? What's your why? What do you want to be doing? And interestingly enough, that was the beginning of her journey. And, working towards that is not an easy question for many people. And it's not an easy question, period. Then the last piece is accountability, and that's when it all comes together. It comes down in a role chart, organization chart, what people do. But this is where I often, when I build organizations, you can have different jobs. Sometimes I even refer to as boxes. I try to break the boxes. But when you're putting it together, you're looking at trying to align factors around people's talents and natural talents. So with smaller organizations and entrepreneurial companies that I often work with, what's really incredible is that we can actually shape the box to the shape of the person and put the organization together with what I call the foundation, which is less possible to do in larger organizations, but it's possible to do within large organizations at a team level and project level. And that's where I think there's a lot of capability that's squandered and wasted or not taken advantage of at that stage. So accountability is the big one that comes in, bolts it down, and stuff around credit. When it's not there, accountability, you're talking about, finger pointing, taking credit, the me first culture. Oftentimes, again, high performance team will often put the team ahead of themselves, but not at the detriment of themselves.
Thanks, Michel. Hey, I just noticed that Marty has his hand up, so I'm just wondering if he needs to flag something.
No, just a question, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Go for it.
How hard, I look at 5 synergies, and how hard do you think engagement or keeping a team members engaged in a work from home setting has developed? Because there's definitely a loss of corporate culture to some degree.
Yeah. Part of the question is actually asked in, how do we develop engagement? And to me, again, as you start just looking at flipping the question on its head, is engagement to me is a result of, it's just like money is a result of a good sales and a good operations process. Engagement is a result of aligning the elements of trust and constructive friction together. So you start looking at what leads into versus. So what I have found, again, it's, and actually we'll see it in the pictures a little bit lower down when we get into the details of it, but there's certain talents, natural talents, that must be in the system. We talked about the clock analogy. I call it clockwork. There's pieces in the clock that need to be present in the team. It doesn't need to be present from the traditional manager role, but it needs to be present in the team system to create those engagement. And we'll talk about those elements, but one of them is actually the connection role. The other one is a coordination role. There's actually the people who are the natural go-tos who transmit information, the people who have that sensitivity to develop people versus just manage the thing or the projects. So usually the lack of engagement is a measurable dysfunction or absence of certain connectors. And those connectors are related to communications, processes, how we mobilize our people, communicate to our people, provide information, tools, trust to delegate, etc. So it's funny because it's one of the elements that we had a lot of discussions with one of the writers of the book, who's in the military, and talking about a high performance team. You can put the analogy around a lot of our, the American SEAL teams or the Canadian Special Forces. Those are high performance teams. And interestingly enough, the fundamental element that came in is trust. It starts there. If the trust is there, then the alignment on the why's there, and the right people in the right place are there. Engagement occurs. Doesn't have to be forced. So oftentimes it's a symbol of a dysfunction of missing pieces.
Thank you.
So the accountability piece is setting clear expectations and standards with measurable collective results. In some points, you know, that's an aha. And interesting enough, there's a lot of systems, management systems are set at the accountability, but they don't link in trust, the constructive friction, engagement specifically as management elements in their system. And so just throwing accountability around doesn't give performance. You need to have that anchoring point. The why, while the why is pretty straightforward, is every person has unique talents and a right to be fully engaged and passionate about the work they do. That's a strong belief. It's part of my why. And providing people the tools to figure that out for themselves. It's not something that they need to be told, but something that they need to figure out for themselves. And again, it's of all ages. I see it with entrepreneurs. Our youngest entrepreneurs in CJEP at 19 years old, and our oldest is in the late 60s, and his 5th or 6th companies. And after I did the debrief, the man was in tears. And he was in tears because of things that he had gleaned from the discovery process around his unique talents that he had not seen, heard, or understood at the time. And was just something that completely released him to be able to progress a lot faster. And so a lot of times we are our own worst enemy ourselves. And oftentimes we're the ones who are actually putting the handcuffs on ourselves and often blaming others. So this why element is, and unique talents are two of the drivers of this value creation. The second one is, oops, there's something missing here. Just if I could move this tile. So this comes into the how. I guess the header's camouflage, sorry about that. And the how is, how do we accomplish this? It's what I call breaking the box. You know, we often say we don't have a lot of talent out there. I still believe in a lot of cases we have missing talent. We actually have, you know, missing square people to put into square boxes because we're unwilling as a society or as an organization to modify those boxes. And to me, that's an abdication of the management process of not looking at the talents we have because there's a lot of talent out there. And I give you one example, and again, it's not a government example, but it shows it was a 2-person company and it was a husband and wife team, and they split the organization saying, Madame will do the operations and the Monsieur will do the sales. Very traditional split of duties. Those are 2 boxes. After doing the talent profile, and they were talking to me about their business and things were not going exceptionally well, and sales calls were difficult, and signing on clients were difficult. And when I looked at the talents, Madame had some of the DNA of sales, the finishing or closing piece. The fellow had the opening door piece and some of the connecting pieces. In the operations, they also shared different pieces of the DNA. So after highlighting that for them, we actually looked at the tasks and of what needed to be done in both sales and operations and how they would collaborate. And very simply, within 10 business days, their entire business process and sales were starting to perform again, and their operations were improving because we didn't put the 2 individuals. Now, what we did is each had the accountability for a box. But what we did is we broke down the talents and saying, you need this person. 1 + 1 is greater than 2 when you're in sales, and in operations, 1 + 1 is greater than 2. And so, by not working harder, by working smarter at the right places, they were able to actually generate more performance. And their business just went crazy, literally in terms of growth, because now they were in the right place. And so I find this element of box can be very, very, very limiting if we see that as being, you know, the end point. And that's why oftentimes when somebody says, you know, I have a role, I go, what flavor? And they go, what do you mean? And that's often the beginning of this discussion. Because just because you have a box, you put a reactive versus a proactive person, you put again, a different unique talent. How is it going to express that box or that requirement? Because to me, the box is not important in terms of the task. It's what are you trying to get out of that role? What is the purpose of the existence of that role? And how is this talented, this unique talent person going to express their leadership in that role is actually somewhat predictable. And so let's have that conversation, what you're trying to get out. And this abstracts from also the traditional stuff. You do have to have the skills, but if you have less skills than someone else, less experience, but you're in your zone of what energizes you, you're more likely to learn it faster. So now we have this other element that organizations often are looking to hire people who've already done the job and are asking them to do it again and again and again. For many, many different people, that's not energizing whatsoever, but it's one of the first criteria we do. Prove to me you've done this entire job so that you can do it again for the rest of your life. And so when you start looking at what energizes people, you also look at the potential for them to learn something and the direction they want to take. And that's when you start actually identifying unique possibilities that you didn't have before. And this is when we're stopped putting, square people in square boxes and actually all of a sudden say, yeah, actually there's a lot of talented people out there. We would maybe just need to structure ourselves a little bit differently to take advantage of it. And that's what I'm teaching organizations that are ready for that, on how to do that. And it is a process. So it's learnable at all levels of organization. So what we're creating is, a common set of skills, a common set of through our process, and a common language to be able to address it. Question, comment? So that's first little section. I think we're going to go into very quickly through process, and then I'm going to run you through a quick survey so we can get through you identifying your own talents tonight and starting to see some connections. A little bit of a simplified version, but it works. So where does all this fit? Again, leadership development is a process. Again, if it's a process, it's measurable. And what we're really trying to do here is between business strategy and results, we're doing a diagnostic essentially, and we're getting feedback. That's what the return on experience is. I often highlight it as just RX for return on experience. And that's a loop that we keep going through. And inside there, we map, or in this case, research data points, we align them, and then we make decisions and get it done, which is the pivot. And so this is not a novel model. It's pretty much, hundreds of different management models out there. And so this is pretty much generic in itself, but it's how do we map? How do we align? How do we pivot? Specifically, I think where the learning is here. So again, this is very accessible to everyone, but it's mapping is getting data, aligning is pulling on the right threads and making sure the connections are proper. And then the pivoting is essentially making decisions and taking action. And then within that, I believe in a very entrepreneurial model, which is learning as you go. We call that oftentimes A/B testing. And it just means that we try things, learn from it, get feedback, adapt the decision, and then go again. And you'll see that that's part of a management system. It creates oftentimes what we call learning organizations. So this element of constant learning. Other elements that come into this are, you'll hear terms in the industry now of well-being intelligence, which I believe is a really interdisciplinary science, but well-being in the large sense goes right from health and safety, traditionally what we've all heard of, to potentially mindfulness and how we how we actually keep for the financial security, the mental security, the health security of our staff. So there's many different securities. My partner had the biggest issue when she had to work from home was actually her desktop setup. It wasn't ergonomic, and because why? We were, for her, we were treating it as something temporary with COVID, and realized that very, very quickly that this well-being component wasn't there. And it's funny because it took organizations several months to start creating, policies around that well-being component, that physical well-being. But within 3-4 weeks, she had, very specific neck and back issues that were produced, and I'm sure she wasn't the only one. So these were, a lot of things that need to be taken into account. I add mindfulness in there because mindfulness is all about mindset, quality decision making, and there's an element around not just the self but the community in there. So that's a whole other domain that is you're going to hear a lot more about in the next coming years, because it's that ability to make a different choice versus being in the automatic. It goes into the autonomous. So that's this whole element of mindfulness. Enduring skills, we understand about the know-how, what I've done, my CV, my experience. We've often talked as well as about emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence. And I really believe, for me, the enduring skills are these energizing talents and our learning agility, our ability to continuously learn, and have a mindset that we're never done learning. It's not like I'm done with university and that's the end of my learning. That was the beginning of a learning process for the rest of the life. So that to me, those three together, I package them as enduring skills. And I think they can create a lot of competitive differentiation for an individual, and definitely within a team and organization setting. And then we have all this diversity and inclusion. I call it diversity intelligence, which really links over time to innovation. And innovation is not something that's automatic. It actually has to be managed. And it's innovation comes from two forces that actually conflict. The one that is driving for change and the one that's resisting for stabilization of an organization. And when properly managed, innovation occurs, and innovation is a bigger step than continuous improvement. But they're all involving, they both involve a significant change process or an ongoing change process. And that tension is always present. So a lot of elements here that come into conflict with different elements within the organization of my own identity versus what my community demands of me, what my colleagues demand of me, what my job demands of me, what my children and spouse demand of me. These are all different elements that come into play. So this is the first place where you start seeing a lot of these elements of conflict. What are we mobilizing when we say collective individuals? It's again, I keep saying individual, team, organization. So you can look at it in all three ways. And tonight we're going to be spending more time on the individual and a little bit on the team side. And then the other one piece that's really important here is that understanding that everything we talked about, there's really a link between what we call the personality of doing, what energizes me, and how an individual creates wealth. And then as you combine that intelligence, that uniqueness with other people, that's when you get the 1 + 1 factor is more than 2. And that's where I have a lot of fun, is really pulling that together into an organization and seeing it work. It's just so rewarding in so many ways. And then that's where I could talk about the measuring the value of your collective intelligence is an intangible that more and more we can find ways to maybe put into the accounting books, because as long as we don't do it, as long as we don't measure it and don't take it into account, it's going to stay an intangible, and intangibles are often just overlooked. So I think part of what I'm trying to bring at the table, I know what part of Chantal was trying to bring at the table, was the ability to actually measure this thing, not to judge, but to leverage it so that we bring these uniquenesses out and together to create value. And I think that's where there's always going to be individuals, teams, and organizations that might abuse these technologies and services like any other technology or services. But overall, I think it's the piece I'm trying to drive home is really that individual leadership, once it's there, lends itself to collective leadership right after. So it's one of the big elements that we're actually writing about in the book is that mobilization. So this just puts in perspective the three pieces I talked about. The hard skills, something we know a lot about. Competencies we've been talking about for years and experience. The soft skills, the behavior profiles, traditional psychometrics, which measures right brain, even the smaller cave brain in terms of our pulsions and styles. These are our automatic reactions, how we're programmed. Mindfulness, Emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence, I put that in the soft skills. Diversity and inclusion is something that in some organizations is lacking, in some teams it's lacking, in some individuals it's lacking. We've seen a lot of examples in Canada, US, worldwide, where that is still to be worked on. So don't want to push it aside. It's very central. And that learning agility here, what I call the cognitive skills, we can talk about how we learn, and then we can talk about horsepower and IQ. There are all different things. They all have different implications. And then the enduring skills is the things that energize us, because if we're energized, we're going to learn. So these become enablers. So there's linkages here. If we're energized, we learn faster. If we're actually mindful, we can actually change the decision quality of what we do individually and collectively. And I'll actually show you that tonight. Alignment of your why and values is knowing where you're going, and focus. Well, you just get there a little bit faster. And then all of these elements together, to me, really bring that element of focus into play to get better results. So that's what, when we talk about collective intelligence, we're talking about all of this together. I'm putting the accent here tonight, but we can't lose sight that you got the hard skills and the soft skills that are always omnipresent in the decision process. And just on top here, that's what essentially creates the key differentiators. They are measurable, and that's how you create the sustainable competitive advantages, is by looking at these elements over here. So the workshop exercise. Before I move on, any questions at this stage? Marty, Pamela? We're good?
I don't see any.
Not for me. I'm not seeing any in the chat. Anybody, if you have questions, I see someone, there's a hand up from Madeline.
Yes,
Marty,
Madeline.
can you let Madeline talk if she wants to talk?
Madeline, you're unmuted.
Thank you. And just warning everyone, I'm sorry, my children are in the background. I'm asked them to keep it down, but if you hear that, sorry about that. I was particularly interested just in your last slide there around the things that you're calling soft skills and things that often are more complex than complicated. And some of the stuff that I'm working on outside of it's not at all framed in or the context is not the same as what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
But it does go into, and you know, all of us, many of us work on policy generally. And so things like this and being able to, and I realize that mine is sort of around policy, but there are some of these same elements here. And this idea of complex versus complicated, the idea of complex generally is that it's very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to put kind of hard boxes around these kinds of things. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts behind, because I understand what you're saying, like measuring, but how do you measure somebody's capacity to be competent or compassionate, not competent, but compassionate, or, you know, their ability to sort of be mindful and either meditate or bring in their capacity to either calm themselves or calm somebody else. Like, these are really sort of sticky kinds of abilities, and they're very much connected to personality and life experience. So how do you sort of, because I feel like measurement is something that can be compared across people or disciplines or something. And I feel like the very personal element of things, it's difficult to do that. So what are your thoughts there?
There's so many thoughts booming in my head. We actually spent a couple hours yesterday just building that framework and model around complexity. And one of the elements, which is part of an answer here, is that if you have a matrix where you have complexity at the bottom and you have kind of policy and governance at the top, at some point, which you have, let's say, for example, you have ministers in the I know at that level where they're non-bureaucrats, they're elected officials, and through rotation, somewhere at the base of the organization, you have these subject matter experts who really, really, truly understand the complexity of a thing. Let's say a rock, whatever that is, a thing within their piece. You've got part of the, that's what we're talking about, is how do you actually find that? Well, really what you've got in the middle is a lot of times is people that feel they're meat in a sandwich in between, but really what you've got is people through a different staircase of skills are being able to bridge that detail complexity with that ability to make recommendations. Somebody can make a decision. The best way that we illustrated it yesterday was with essentially the analogy that you don't need to know how to build a car to drive one. But somebody needs to know how the different pieces in their intricate elements are. But somebody had to make a decision on the design as well and make a decision. So we were talking about is all these mechanisms around how the brain works and how you simplify things. So that was one dimension around dealing with complexity. We were actually, and continue to actually be working through is, well, what are the talents and skill sets required for that? And in a lot of cases, you'll see it later in the model, but we start getting into a lot of what we call the linkages, talents, which are, they don't actually deliver anything physical, they deliver coherence. Part of what we talked about earlier as well, just getting back into the element of trust. In most organizations, I would say just do a 360 with any person with regards to where they are. How do you measure it? It's with, you know, almost the old thumbs up or down with colleagues and people that often will be able to say, is that person in there? But and then you've got a number of different psychometric tools that actually are fairly advanced today in being able to not address, but quantify elements of emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence. But then I think the issue here is like everything else, when you measure it, you're making, you know, you're measuring a small straw on something that's much vaster. So you're taking pieces and then you know, and then fundamentally making assumptions on that. So I think one of the most practical ways I find when I go into organizations is essentially that 360-degree feedback loop. But you can only do that truly in the model we're talking about in a constructive way if the trust is there. Otherwise, it becomes an ego process or a process of difficulty. So even with the entrepreneurs, when we're going through the feedback process, I have a certain percentage of them that are just not ready to actually look in the mirror. That whole process of getting constructive feedback, they're not there yet. And so I think part of it is you know, to answer your question is, yes, there's tools to measure pieces of it. The dynamic in teams often leaves with the 360 process the ability to feel it's there or it's not there and recognize it. In an organization where trust exists, you can get that feedback. And then in some of the tools that I have here, I can see gaps. And I'll show you one of the gaps specifically I did with one organization that went from 12 employees to 75 employees. But in this particular case, the soft skill, it was really related to communication, but they had built silos between all the organizations. They weren't talking to each other. But it was, there was a missing piece in the clockwork. And with another team, there was a different missing piece in the clockwork. So the dysfunctionality of not talking to each other was actually due to two different reasons. One of them was due to the fact that they were not connecting with each other, networking, and making those. The other one was actually related to the fact that they were not, nobody was stepping back to look at the forest versus the trees. And sometimes you get it because individuals are too busy going into action to deliver the goods, the program management versus the people management, the soft piece. So oftentimes part of what you're talking about here, it's not one thing, can be different things. So I'll show you tonight one model that starts looking at the flow of it. And then you've got a bunch of other tools that can measure different pieces of it to see where you're at. And when you put them together, it gives you a little bit more insight. And most of the times I don't come into organizations knowing everything or the tests tell me everything. What the results of these testings are giving me paths to question, threads to pull on. So the intelligence doesn't come from Michel or the system. The intelligence comes from the people. And that's where I'll show you there's actually a section called feedback. And when you break it down into its components of what kind of feedback, there's expert feedback, there's advisory feedback, there's the collective intelligence of the individuals, and then there's the measurement, that ability to pull back and take stock, you know, dashboarding and looking at the metrics as well as part of feedback. when you start breaking down those, that's what gives you more of the insights. And that's you get from actually knowing who to connect with. So sometimes what happens is with the tests and the surveys that I use, they're not giving me the answer. They're telling me something's broken there. And then it's through the questioning process of actually, it actually helps me formulate the right question. Then we get the insights from the people. And it's interesting because as a consultant, I come in from outside of the system. The people in the system often don't. There's a lot of the complexity science. Dan is our complexity guru on this, and he was saying, Michel, he was going, if you're in the system, you can't be on top of it and look at it at the same time. And so the testing that we do permits us to then start asking the questions, drawing out the right information, and then making the right conclusions. In itself, for us, the tests themselves don't come in and do the diagnostics. So same thing with the psychometrics. I often say something is creating the situation for you. What can that be? And the person starts talking and explain it. It's like, okay, what do you want to do with that? And so that's where the connections are for these things.
Yeah. Can I just, I went through the full battery of tests and everything with Michel, and I have to admit, I'm trained into a little bit of skepticism about, psychometric testing and various sort of management things. And I have to say, going through the whole thing, I was like, oh man, it nailed a few things that I was sort of aware of, but that I had not had a chance, I had not kind of been able to put my finger on. And I would say for me personally, like looking at all this stuff if you're looking at trying to think of who you want on your team or who you want in your organization, I think the key thing is to try to find people who have a learning mindset. It's like, aside from all of these things, if you are willing to look at yourself and be told something that is a little bit unfamiliar and then shift yourself, that's when you're going to get something out of this. So I know that all of you guys who are here, you're here because you have that learning mindset. So I really recommend that you try to, keep an open mind and go through the little mini version that Michel is gonna put us through of his process and see if you feel like you learned anything about yourself, because I'd be surprised if you don't.
The other part of the answer, it's a harsh one, but you can bring a horse to water, you can't make him drink. So you can't force people into this who don't want to be there. And so there's an element there that oftentimes, like I said, mindfulness is not a switch where you're on and off one day. It's painstakingly hard. It's to be on all the time. And so that's why I use the word strive. I think mindfulness is just an ability to step back. What do you do now that you step back with that talent? So in itself, mindfulness does nothing. It creates an environment to step back and breathe. And then if you apply it in observing, and that observation changes into an action versus a reaction, well, you're likely going to make a better decision. And so there's a causal link there when you start breaking it down. And this is what we're doing with Dan in complex systems, is break it down to some components. But the thing is our whole discussion yesterday was we tend to dumb it down into a few options because human beings can only deal with a few options. So how do you bridge it between, well, it's that people that have the facility of being these connectors, and some of the talents you're going to see tonight is actually that connection, those connection talents. There's people who do that very well. That doesn't mean the others don't have the connection talents. It means that their appetite to develop it may not be as, but that means that they'll have other talents and they're as needed. So there's no judgment here around it. It's just that at some point, connectors who practice it all the time and it energizes them, will probably be more talented just because they practice more.
Excellent, excellent. Michel, I'm just mindful, I've got one eye on the clock and Marty is forcing me to put both eyes on it, but we did kind of sell this to people as like an hour and a half session-ish. We're happy to stay longer if you want to stay, but maybe we should encourage to roll along just in case some people have to.
I'm gonna then we're probably I'm probably gonna be in the doo-doo on that one. But let's I'm gonna go
if you're willing to go longer, but yeah.
Well, I'm going to try to respect people's time as well. So the first one, Energizing Talents, it was a quick survey. Choose one or three of the dynamics that you feel best represent how you like to work, and I'll comment on the second screen. And if you're having difficulty choosing, for those who have difficulty to choose one, you can put them in order of preference, anywhere from 1 to 5, or I love this, this is neutral, this I dislike. But you should, at some point, have a gradation in. There's some that you'll like more than others, and those are the few, those 1, 2, possibly 3 that you're going to go, oh, I really get, that really resounds with me. So take a moment here and look at these elements here. And this bar here, I wish I could get rid of it. It's really disturbing because it's in the way here. How do I get this out of the way here? My God, I'm trying to move this bar. It's like stuck there. Anyhow, so the keywords is you choose 1, 2, or 3 of these in order of preference, whether you prefer the adapt definition, the things, and go with your gut in terms of what you think you like. You like to concretize, you like to influence, you like to integrate, or you like to regulate. And this is more around the adapt is likes to prompt change, generate new ideas and points of view, innovate. It's often the disturber in the group. You like to concretize. You like to get things done, concretize, finalize, and preserve. Those are usually the people that are GTD, getting things done. The influencer likes to analyze ideas and actions, perceives necessities, screens, filters, provides feedback, not necessarily in the doing whatsoever. Sometimes we can call it the armchair critic. Integrate likes to organize, adapt decisions and choices, plan and project actions into an environment. Again, not necessarily the person who's doing anything. Deregulate likes to maintain cohesion by conveying and circulating information, ideas, and putting the right people in the right place at the right time. So just take a moment and write 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 if there's a preference. If you have a second or third preference, okay too. For some, you might just want to put them in the order that you think that would be your preferences. What's important here is that we highlight 1 or 2 where you think is going to be dominant in your style in terms of what energizes you. This is not what you know how to do. This is what you think you like to do. And you may not have experience with it. Again, you're going with your gut. You're going with what energizes you. I'll leave that up for a couple more seconds. Okay. So according to Expert 5A, this is more again of a, they have 5 dynamics or archetypes that act components of the clockwork, or the clockwork is the leadership management system I talked to you about. What this means is bringing coherence, harmonization, alignment, and accountability to the system. So all the pieces are required, like a clock. And later on, we're going to be linking very specific talents that energize you, the team, or the organization, because we don't, as an individual, cover all the categories, okay? At some point, we all have preferences. And so if, for example, I'm a number 4, I'm an integrator. And when I get into the detail of what that means, I like to connect ideas into action and organize that. I'm not the strategist. I often work well with strategists that say, hey, I've got a great idea. I'd like to do this. How do we do that? And I make that connection. And that's probably why I like working with organizations that are fast growing, because they need a lot of that connection happening. So that's my talent. My secondary talent is linkages. What are yours? So you'll be looking at your elements here in a moment. So just, again, are you adapt, concretize? We had the feedback here. We had the integrator and the linkages. This is really bothering me here. There we go. So the adapt, very quickly, is the visionary persona. It's the one who likes to prompt change, generate new ideas, points of views, and project and innovate. It's the person who likes to disturb the status quo, provoke change within constraints. Again, what's a constraint? A budget is a constraint. An organization is a constraint. A community is a constraint. A family is a constraint. The shaper, so that's the 2, is the one who likes to get the things done, to seek to capture, conserve, and preserve the know-how, how things are done as well. So these are the people that get things done. They deliver. The feedback filtration influencer, the one who likes to analyze the ideas, actions, perceived necessity, filter, provide feedback. We critically analyze the achievements, ideas, and actions. It perceives the needs without necessarily committing oneself. So again, it's not the person who's necessarily doing. Maintains the dynamic of the project and of its protagonists. That critical feedback is really important for the management system. The integrator is the one who likes to integrate and organize strategies and decisions to action. Doesn't mean they take the action. Arbitrage decisions. At some point, you can't go, sometimes you have to go left or right. You can't go straight. To ensure coherence and alignment between the conservation and the innovation. So again, we have the innovation here and the conservation here, 2 tensions. We have the integrator and the filtration, the critique, another 2 tensions. And then we have the third, which is the pivot point. And this whole integrator is actually well documented in Juno Wickman's traction book on EOS, Entrepreneurial Organization System. Hundreds of thousands of organizations are using it to manage their organizations. And it's really well documented there. The difference between the visionary and the integrating. What's really interesting is when you start studying a little bit about decision quality, the visionary creates the challenge, which is the ideas and the expansion, and the integrator synthesizes. So actually strategy, decision-making is a 2-step process. Strategizing is a 2-step process. We don't often treat it as a 2-step process. And so if somebody has one or the other talent, they actually are missing a talent to be more complete in the ability to strategize. And this becomes what I call almost like little pumps that work in 2 cycles. You get a lot of those elements that come in. And then the conveyor is all the linkages we talked about, which was part of the answer, Madeline, comes from the detailed talents within this area. The ones who like to maintain cohesion of the group and ideas by conveying and circulating information on what, how, and who. And in COVID, those are the people who actually have a facility. It energizes them to connect with people in that way. And they don't need the physical space. They do it automatically. Maintain the harmonization of the system, team, unit, or group. Okay, so you've got 5 dynamics here that are starting to work, and we're just creating a little shape around it. Okay, so we're going to move on there. So situate yourself with that. Where are you? Okay, and that's where I am. That's my dominant, and that's my secondary. Okay, so you might have 1, 2, you might have 3, you might have put them in order. Doesn't really matter. Just understand from where your dominant point is usually your first and second elements. So now we can start looking at just a bunch of dynamics in there, and I'm going to show you just a few quickly here. So let's discuss the implications of this. This is what we call the operational axis. This is what we call the team in the field. So when you're looking at a team with the talents you have, when you look at that, imagine having an organization. So the operational axis is what takes the vision down to the ground and making it real. So if you have an organization that's green, and I know some of those, or a team that's all green, and they love to adapt things, but nobody's delivering, what do you think is going to happen? Or vice versa. And I know many organizations that have an imbalance just in those 2 factors. They've got a bunch of people that are all people who concretize, operate, but they'll have a difficulty in pivoting and changing. And that can be viewed. I remember an organization with 25 engineers, president calls me and says, Michel, I have a problem. Everybody's, they're all sustainers. And that was the whole conversation. Yes, because he had hired people to do with a sustaining mindset. So he had very, very strong team in a concretized. He had one person in the adapt, which was a student who was there on weekends, which was the person that would love to break the rules and make things progress differently, change the status quo. These people were busy protecting the status quo. Neither one or the other is good. It depends what your goals are. Depends what your organization of raison d'être is for. But in a system, you need both. And a bit like a clock, not every piece is as equally important as the other, but not necessarily at the same time. This is where we'll start looking at the temporal side of it. But essentially, just take a look. So Michel, me, if I'm here as an integrator, maybe I'm less useful in this operational element. So I was a good HR operator, but I'm a much better integrator. So I wasn't in failure here. I was probably doing more linking because that's where my networking skills. So I always was known as a bridge builder between functions. So I expressed my leadership through linking instead of doing, which meant trying to get at the right people at the right place at the right time and make that work. So that's how I expressed my leadership as an HR operator, if you want. So when I was in an operation role, I was principally working here in the linkages in number 5. Constructive tensions between innovation and conservation, we talked about, very important to keep a healthy organization. The projectional axis technically doesn't deliver anything except coherence. It's about harmonization of strategies and decisions. And this is where we start looking at coherence equals to trust. We leverage the collective intelligence resident within the organization. So the tension happens between the integrator needing to make decisions, and are they leveraging the collective intelligences, the expertises, the advice, the knowledge, the know-how of the organization? Are they leveraging it? Are they connecting with it? And so again, you have this systemic tension between those two poles that are very important for the health of the system. And that constructive tension is to balance the inputs between feedback and the arbitration of complex choices. So that's what I was saying is if you don't, so if you're a prime minister and you don't go and get the intelligences of your subject matter experts that gets eventually synthesized into good options, you're going to be in dysfunction. You're going to be disconnected. And we do see that in government and organizations and in a lot of different places when there's a misalignment here. Questions, comment on those two linkages? Just trying to make some simple linkages here with your own style. And then we'll come back to it a little bit more dynamics. So the next one I want you to show you is that I'm number 4 over here, and I'm a 5 over here as a secondary. And I'm going to go through just the project dynamics. So we looked at team on the field and we looked at projectional, which you don't deliver anything but coherence, and here you deliver things. And then on the project basis, the talents, the initializers, are Q1 people who would have a love for something in the 1, 5, and 3, usually 1 and 3. So here we have the expertise, the influencer, and we have usually a creative. Well, guess what? They're often are people who are the innovators. It's that combination of creativity, which is a subset of here, and expertise here. So you put those two together and you've got what you call a Q1 profile, which is usually people who initialize, inventors, etc. The Q2 profiles are often our entrepreneurs. They're people we call developers. They like to challenge, organize, make things happen. They like to break new barriers, new products, new services. It's the breakthrough. So they like to scale things, make them grow, see them grow. It's all about bigger, faster, better. Q3 is our stabilizers. They like growth, but project management, getting things done, concrete. How do we do it? And then you've got the Q4 profile, which brings the people who concretize with the influencers back full circle. These are our dynamic people who are really dynamizers in the organization. They're often the individuals that I'll go get feedback from, because they do the return on experience. They go, oh, our organization has this knowledge. Well, what are we doing with it? Again, if we have the knowledge and the expertise, but we're not creatively moving it towards the green zone here, we're going to stall, because this is a system. And then here, there's people that evaluate their critical analysis. They'll make abandonment decisions versus improvement. Do we improve this product, the service? Do we kill this product or services? How do we move forward? So these are the people that often have the knowledge and talents to do that. So again, you can look at this from the previous side. We talked about from a team on the field or projectional, but you can also look at it from a project perspective. What's really interesting is I had a team of students. There were 8 groups of 4 students, MBA, Paris University, and the Q1s, what do you think happened with their projects versus a Q3 team? It was very simple. The Q1s were really, really able to kick off their project. Ideas were flowing, first project, and boom, they get it, and then they'd stall. My Q3s would stall initially, and then they'd get started, agonize, get started, agonize, finally get their topics 3-4 weeks later, and then all of a sudden, they're stabilized, their subject is clear, boom, they go, and they're delivering. Well, it was simple. I would tell the Q1 team, you're going to need to help the Q3 teams get started, and later on, they're going to give you a hand, not only to get started, but to help you get to the finish line. And you can even use this in a sports analogy in racing. You can use this in a team format, whether it's engineering, marketing, operations, policy. You've got a negotiation cycle, goes through this entire loop as well, and different talents. And again, there's different talents. That's why we had the individual person that was the husband and wife team. The husband had the adapt and linkage skill set, and his wife had the concretize skill. She was the finisher. She was the person that would get that contract closed. She was the closer. He was the door opener. So together, they didn't sell any, individually, they didn't sell anything. Together, they were just a powerhouse. And this is how we start looking at the shaping of this 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, so that's another way to look at it. So now we're starting to see flow information coming from this. And then your profile dynamic, again, what energizes you? If you just do your own mapping, are you in an area 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? I'm in 4 and a little bit of 5. Does that put you in operational projectional axis mainly? So for me, I'm slightly more projectional. So it means I'm more into building coherence than actually the axis of getting things done. What project phase? I don't happen to be in a project phase. I actually connect Q2s and Q3s. So that's what my profile does. But it starts situating how Michel, in this case, exercises, or how my dynamic energizes me. When I'm doing this, it's creating energy for me. So when I'm helping organizations growing to stabilize, well, guess what? That's why I deal with high growth organizations, because they go from 10 to 100 employees and things break. And they're like, what do we do? And for me, it's an obvious to help them bridge that gap, because that's what I do. And that's what I love to do. And then that's what the implications are here, is just in a very simplified model, because we actually use 20 talents. Each of these are broken into 4. Just with this very simplified model, we already start seeing, where do I situate myself vis-a-vis my leadership style, and how does that have? So for me, if I'm in decision mode, I need to go and leverage these influencers. I need to go see what's happening on the floor to the people who are actually doing the work. I'm somewhat okay with the linkages. I might need to do a check in there, and I'll go see the people who are the challengers, who will say, hey, Michel, did you think of this? Did you think of that? Did you think of this? Oh, by the way, here's some few more ideas. Okay. So in my profile, and I'll integrate that and bring it back to them. And so that's, again, how do I connect best? Well, I connect with people who would bring this element of 2, 3, and 1, makes me stronger. It creates also, too, if people are in their energy when they're doing that, and I'm in my energy, well, then we're basically 1 + 1 = more than 2. That's in a very simple way. Again, come back to the pieces of a clock. There's 5 pieces of a clock. I don't cover all the pieces. And when I put myself together with people who cover all the pieces, then we really work well together. And what's interesting is for the book, the person who's the analyst to the prime minister brings the green, the serial writer brings the concretization, and the general brings this element here of feedback and intelligence. And so as a natural team, and several of us are connectors. So as a natural team, we work really well together, and again, are producing a product that neither one of us could have produced individually. Questions, comments? How that can apply to a team? And then the foundation of trust. And this kind of gets into a slightly different chapter of things. So Pam, we could actually stop here because I actually go through this entire matrix, or it all depends if people want to shut out here, or we can continue, and there's about 15-20 minutes more of material.
Folks, what do you
really,
think?
Team choice.
I think Michelle, I think if you're willing to keep going and finish, we're down to five dedicated participants.
Okay.
Maybe put your hands up if you want Michelle to stop, or versus being willing to stay. But I mean, I think if you're willing to stay, may as well finish, and people who need to leave can watch the recording at the end. But I think that this is valuable to folks. It's funny because when we did my profile, Sophia is saying, please continue. So there we go. But when we did my profile, I thought this really mapped very well with some of the stuff that we knew, right? Which is, to me, and Mary Claire says, okay, she's okay, she'll stay if we continue. So I think that's a few votes in favor.
Okay,
but
and if anybody needs to shut down, that's okay too. So I respect that as well, and we'll have, like you say, the recording here for those that would like to watch it later.
Perry has a question asking why talk is spelled T-A-W-K.
Exactly that. That's why I put it in brackets. It was just a quacky way of writing it. So walk the talk. It's something I saw, walk the talk, exactly, and transparent decision making. But it's for no other reason than just to make it rhyme with walk in its own writing style. So we're back here full cycle with walking the talk. And what's interesting is when we're in our energy, so doing what we like to do, we often are walking the talk because it's energizing to us. And this is where we need to also understand what actually drains us. And that's what actually the cause of burnout is that we're working and it's squeezing the lemon, and it's taking our energy instead of generating energy. What's really interesting is that when I'm doing that integration stuff, I don't see the day go by. I feel really rewarded at the end of the day, and I'm ready, fully energized, versus being grounded to a halt or slowed down or feeling frustrated. Doesn't mean that everything I do is easy or that there are great moments, but there's this element of energize. That's why I use the word energize. It actually doesn't feel like a day of work. You actually come out of it with a gas tank full of gas. And so what happens with burnout is this systematically, squeezing of energy to a point where at some point, and again, when people lose sight of where they're going, and it'd be like me putting you on a treadmill and say, run a marathon, but not tell you how many kilometers you've ran, it's going to be at some point going, hey, what the hell? What's happening here? This is not pleasant. So again, all these elements here talk about fundamentally, that element of the of this iceberg here is the base is walking this talk, and it's a lot easier to do that and do transparent decision making when we're in our energy. What's interesting is that where I have blind spots or short-sightedness elements, somebody that brings in the talent will actually automatically fill in the gap. And that's the other components where there's almost this automatic glue that takes place when you bring the right people together. So the energizing talents we talked about is really harmonizing this element of coherence and trust. It's this is the constructive tension that needs to be, that's necessary to input, to balance these inputs of feedback and the arbitration of, and I put complex choices, because this is where you're negotiating complexity within the organization. That subject matter expert in the organization, is that person being heard? Is that making it into the decision process? Yes or no? If it's not, you're going to have a lot of difficulty in organization managing change and innovation and change, and making those complex choices, because you won't have the right inputs. So that's the element of trust, is coherence in that alignment over here. It gets a lot more real when you start looking at the elements within it, because we're dealing here with, in the integration, we're dealing with the piloting of strategy and arbitration of decisions. We're dealing with the organization structure, and then we're also dealing with how we dispatch resources at a project level. So it's basically those resource decisions. Who do we resource? Who do we don't? And that's what we're integrating. And then the influencing is essentially the expertise, that ability to pull back and see the forest from the trees, where people can get very critical, dashboards and metrics, the people talents, and how and the advisory talents in the organization. So you're really reconciling these two. Constructive friction is the next one, and this is constructive friction. We talked about between the need to change and the need to stay the same, and that in an organization that has to work constantly, and there needs to be trust in order to get constructive friction. Otherwise, it becomes destructive conflict. And that's the need to change versus stabilize. That drives value creation at the team and organization level between agility, innovation, sustainability, and learning organization. But what I like, it also drives a huge element between ourselves, the me versus the non-me. It's who I am. The me is actually the number 2 here. It's the stabilizer. I am me, and I want to evolve to a non-me. It means I have to evolve, you have to let something go. So we talked about who do I want to become, but it's not only who I want to become, it's what am I going to let go? And you can't evolve if you stay the same. And so that is actually a creative tension. There's another one between me versus my community. My community is this element here that stabilizes, yet I want to adapt. I want to evolve. I want to change. I'm not the same me. How many people say, hey, the worst, I used to say to people, they would come in and say, hey, you haven't changed a bit. To me, that was almost like an insult because to me, it meant that I hadn't adapted. I don't want to be the same person I was 10 years ago. I have my values. I have a lot of fundamentals, but hopefully there's been this evolution process, at least in my own vision of myself. And so you can look at this system from a very personal way when I do coaching to a very much an organizational lever on how organizations produce value. Operations usually, sales and R&D, finance, administration. They are forces that help to adapt or stabilize organizations and created this constant constructive conflict. And then you have the constructive conflict we talked about, vertically between the integration role, the influencing role. That's the need to harmonize strategies and decisions, inputs, analyze expertise and challenges. And the way we leverage our collective intelligence with organizations, again, back to the clockwork, are we consulting our intelligence and the people who have it? And that's why, as a consultant, oftentimes with a test, I know who to go see. Because if there's an organization with 1,000 people, I can't do 1,000 interviews. And historically, I used to take 3 to 4 hours to do an interview to get, and in a week, so you can do about 10, and then you have to go through all the data. And today with the tests, I can short circuit that and basically zero in on different pieces that I need much more quickly. So what used to take me 80 hours to do, I can do in 10 hours today. Like it's that mind-boggling in terms of providing data points when we talk about measurability. It doesn't mean I have all the solutions. It just means I know where to go now, and I know how to navigate through that organization to get what I need in order to be able to help the organization in making their assessment. And so there's also the constructive conflict in the regulation. The regulation role 5 is a constant adjustment of conflict in different ways. So it's the way we link and mobilize people, process, information, and ideas, literally. So it is in itself another hub. And I often look at the regulation role as the role that I often say it's the oil in the engine, is the way I look at it. It's necessary to create that harmonization. So the people who have appetite for regulating are basically helping the fluidity of the organization operate. And that gets us to engagement. 1 + 1 = 2. You see me say that. And so, directly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And then, but what does that mean? It's just that complementariness and talents that we talked about. If I'm here integrating and linkages, if I bring in talents of adaptation, of concretization, and of influence in the team will be more balanced, irrespective of what our know-hows are. So we can talk about decision-making mindsets. When we have gaps, they tend to lead to, the word is risks and dysfunctions when they're not addressed. So for example, I'm integrate linkage. If I don't go connect here purposefully, it's going to create a gap. That gap is going to create a risk of dysfunction if it's a blind spot and I keep doing it. Then we get into irritants. Some of these talents for some people can be actually irritating. Somebody who's extremely creative, and I've seen with that, might have an irritation in actually producing, or vice versa. Somebody who loves to produce might have and produce something they're used to, might have an irritation and adaptation. Those are elements that we'll talk about irritants. They also can shape organizations. I saw an organization when I talked about hiring, they went from 12 to 75 people. The 2 founders had an irritation with process. So they systematically hired 73 other people who didn't like process. And so by the time they were 75 people, they went from 12 to 75. They did not double in productivity because they didn't scale. They were managing a 75 people like they were when they were managing 12 people. And they miserably failed. And it was literally the test within 5 minutes told me, it's like, started asking here, who likes process? We don't want any process here. Oh, okay. Again, for an individual not liking process, one thing, to build it into your clock work system, in your entire system, and make sure everyone doesn't like process, they were set up to fail. So we actually had to bring the company back down to 40 people to triple their productivity and then rebuild from there. And it was funny because we used, instead of using the word process, I remember using the word, it was in French, but it was meaning guardrail. So I said, okay, we won't use the word process, but you need guardrails. Otherwise you're going to go off the road. Okay, we get that. And they did it. And again, they were able to adjust. And then we hired a few key positions in the operations, literally with guardrails to put in the processes so they could deliver. So it's literally this model in action that we just went through tonight. It's which 5 boxes you can actually do quite a bit of assessment using your intuition. Don't necessarily need to test for the basic stuff. You need to test when you get into more complex situations where you need more precise data. It's like everything else. The faster you want to go, the more precise you want to be, the more you need tools. And this is why I use, it's very much a predictive index of engagement. Because if I'm doing integration and linking work, I can tell you I'll be engaged. So if you give Michel other stuff, I'm likely to be disengaged. It's going to use my energy. And this is where a very basic mapping, I actually put this in a spreadsheet with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s and get people to just write down their tasks and just tell you if they like them or not. And then you take a look at the amount of time on tasks they like versus tasks they don't like, and you get the equation of engagement pretty fast. And the question becomes, can we optimize teams and build teams in such a way that we can optimize every individual a little bit more? to do something better than Gallup that says 67, 2/3 of people are disengaged, that's a really bad score. If we brought that down to 50%, 1 in 2, wow, productivity would go through. If we brought that down to 1/3, wow. And so they're very basic tools in order to do that. And with many organizations, we just basically use a very basic spreadsheet, putting the task and just putting I like, I'm neutral, or I dislike on the task that they have to do, and then the amount of work they have to do, and then take a look at potentially on how to redesign roles in organizations. So it's actually, I shouldn't say that simple, but it's a very effective, simple tool. Then we get into, again, with the Expert 5A, we get into fractals. So we went from 5 dynamics that we used tonight into 20, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. So we have 20 talents, and this is where they are. So as you start understanding in the visionary, well, we have the green of green here, because you'll see there's mindsets in here. So the green of green is the visionary, is the pure creative person. The strategic, the red of green, is the challenger, the one who actually produces options for strategists. So that this is the combination here we talked about for strategy, which is a little pump. The intelligent is a scout, is the person we send ahead of the group. It's often related to salespeople or other roles where they'll try things before others before they bring it to the team. There's people who have actually the appetite to try things before others have. There's people that do videos on LinkedIn, not LinkedIn, YouTube and whatnot, even with the shopping. They're ahead of others in looking at products and services. They're called influencers oftentimes. And then you have the concrete, the achievers. So of the green section is the explorer, is the person that goes sees what's happening elsewhere. Benchmarking. We should do that here. Oh, the doer. So there's linkages between all these boxes. Won't get into that, but it's just to give you a sense that once we can do the exercise in a very straightforward way with the team with only 5 factors, the 20 give me and give teams a lot of tools to be able to a further depth. And then it brings in a few additional elements like problem solving and mindset into the equation. So once you get into that, from the 20 talents, you get 4 decision mindsets, which is how one addresses problems and approaches decision making. And that's one of the things I really love to do, is work on mindsets. The green mindset we talked here, in this case, the green, the creative, somebody who needs to explore freely. And the black is need to see pragmatic elements. The scout in this case here is need to have time to analyze all the elements. And the challenger in the system is need to understand the broad lines. So if I bring that back into my profile, my mindset goes from green to black. So if I go from green to black, my tendency as a leader, or in my style, is to go from brainstorming, need to freely explore, creative, whatever you want to call it, to getting things done. So I'm often one in a meeting that will go, okay, what needs to get done, blah, blah, blah. We go through the things and it's like, okay, let's go. So where's my Achilles heel? Well, I have to do a check-in for myself to make sure I stay connected to the strategy and to make sure that I go collect the inputs that I need, because my tendency is to go into action, to go from a specific idea, organize it into action. So that's my default setting. If I'm not being aware, I'm going to forget to connect to strategy, and I'm going to forget to connect to the intelligences. That wouldn't be too cool. So as a good project manager, I do that check-in. So what happens is there's other talents that oftentimes, like there's a good friend of mine that he's really much into these broad lines, and oftentimes our collaboration is phenomenal when we're looking at those elements. And I've had another friend, actually the one who's the analyst for our prime minister, which is the blue. And he's very, very much this person that'll bring in the details and do the research. So these are complementary, But even if I'm alone, this is my dynamic. So my own personal check-in to be coherent and functional is to make sure that I look at these two factors. And so this is something that's available to anyone to do to understand their own dynamic. And this is at some point where that additional detail only becomes available as we start going more into, and this is the last slide, just to wrap up, that at the end, it's all about taking a step back. We talked about mindfulness. Mindfulness in itself does nothing except pull you back. And then there's what do you do with that? And the important piece here is that we all have paradigms, and these paradigms are shaped by our culture, education, experiences, family, community, health and safety, how we feel about health and safety, our community, our careers, our friends, our colleagues, a bunch of things. What's important though is that these are, my reality, my filters, my perceptions. Today, we just went through 2 hours of a workshop. And we might say we're on the same page, but I would say, no, it all depends on from what your experiences are. Your experience today, each of you have a unique one. And it will always be unique because you have a different frame of reference. And this is the other place that we often make assumptions is that, and I've seen, I can give so many examples of CEOs putting their staff into conflict because they made assumptions that their staff would like the same things they did. And one simple example, I had a CEO who was a creative marketing genius, and to thank her marketing specialist, she gave him the right to do the creative direction and actually put him in dysfunction because he had an allergy, an I5, what we talked about, an irritant in creativity. So she thought she was doing something to say thank you to him, and actually for 2 weeks he couldn't produce. And she had no idea why. Because she made an assumption on this is something I like, therefore if he's in marketing, it's good for him too. And all of a sudden, bam, productivity is 0. Why? Because it's our paradigms, our reality, our filters. So don't, that's one of the first steps is, and this is a trap that we all step into. And some of the great readings, and I'll leave that there. Shane Parrish is actually an Ottawa resident. He was with CSIS for many years. He published 3 books. The third one just came out recently, but they call it Great Mental Models. But it's really about the quality of your thinking depends on the models in your head. And so one of the things I encourage all leaders to do, just like we come back here, understand your paradigms, understand from where you're making decisions, because that's the way to help you improve how you make decisions when you do step back. And stepping back is hard to do. So mindfulness is not something that you're mindful or you're not. It's really hard to be mindful some of the time. And that's what I think leadership is all about. And sustainable leadership is about being a little bit more mindful, making slightly better decisions more often. And so with that comes the element of accountability when we set clear expectations, standards, and measurable and collective results. And that's where we do that last bit of connection. So oftentimes we start looking at accountability in the matrix when performance is not working. And then we say, oh, people aren't engaged. And then we say, oh, they're not dealing with conflict. And then nobody trusts each other because they're doing it backwards. With that, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Michel. That's great. Guys, do you have any questions for Michel before we wrap up? I see a thank you from Mary Claire, but I'm just wondering, so like it was really interesting to me to go through this process for myself, but also in terms of, thinking about, quite frankly, thinking about some of the people who have annoyed me over the years as a boss or as, the chair of a board or all of these different things. And I guess, do you have any advice, like from the perspective of someone who is, say, an individual contributor rather than a manager? What can that person do? Like, how can they identify, what is their best qualities and realize, like, if they're not in a good fit, how should they approach their manager, their boss or organization to go about trying to find a better fit?
there's so many angles to this question, and I can only answer it with, I think, two quick examples. I guess that I lived when I was at Nortel. Nortel had a reputation to promote someone beyond their when they were viewed as not performing or incompetent, they would be promoted, given a great evaluation, promoted and dumped. And I was in Ottawa, and we received one of these people from Toronto. So I picked up the phone because I was a leadership trainee. I had connected with people well outside of Ontario region, and basically called a colleague in Toronto and said, "I don't have a pencil in my hand. Please tell me what's the poop." So I said, "Something's wrong here." And a lot of elements of dysfunctional came in, and it was interesting because I believe at the time, with no pretense, we were a high performance team, doing a significant amount of work, and you could see the employees. At the time, I was a supervisor first level for a recruiting team, and this was the manager for the team coming in. And high performance teams, like I said at the beginning, will actually purge people who don't fit, and it could be fit for different reasons. In this case, there was a culture fit element. The person was, and I nothing to the individual. I think that he was incompetent in the role that they put him in. I don't know what his competence was, but in that specific role, we did not need as a team what he was bringing in. So in this case, it was literally, they realized that, management realized that this transfer was just not going to work. And they had moved the guy's family and everything. It was, the wholesale transfer and the whole kit. So I think part of it, again, is when you do have high performance teams, a lot of these elements that don't fit. On the other hand, though, when you do have high performance teams, back to constructive conflict, are we dealing with a misfit, or are we dealing with conflict that we're going to resolve? And this is where I think you start getting it. And myself, for example, at some point I became dysfunctional with my first male boss, because my first 3 bosses were women. I had great mentorship, and actually I realized many years later that the problem was here, because there was, different things like that. He irritated me for many different things. One of them, he was very oriented towards taking credit for stuff and throwing shit down the pile. So we talked about a little bit of the finger pointing, and also to I remember I was sitting next to the VP's office. So all of a sudden it was like, "No, Michel, you need to come in at 9 and leave at 5. And I had never done 8 hours. Like I usually do 9, 10. So, I'd be in. And I remember I chose at that time the inappropriate way of going to war with the man, which was like, if you expect me to come in at 9, it'll be the last time that you see me staying till 6 or till 7 or 8 or 9, which I used to do frequently again. So it was kind of like, I'm going to work to rule. So you get into this reaction mode. And I only realized that years later, many things from taking this step back. One of them is the self-knowledge that this element of fighting is actually something that came out throughout my career in 30 years. I would take on certain battles and just make it a project. And I'm very good when I choose my projects. And they were literally battles. It was just, again, this element of the challenger just wanting to punch into something. And you got to realize that, because at some point, that was one of the threads that says, well, am I exercising leadership, or am I exercising what? So, and when do I do it, and how do I do it? This was a big element for me in understanding that element and shifting fundamentally where I put my energy years later. But it took me years to figure that one out. So that was one element with that, but it came back to a reaction with the first boss. And in this case, it had nothing to do with incompetency. It had nothing to do. He was just a person that irritated the hell out of me. And at some stage, this is where you have to look at the system. In his case, he was just going to be transitory there. So, and I know in certain divisions, like with the Foreign Service, I've been told by people in the administrative ranks who are there a long time and not going anywhere, because their jobs are settled there. They get a boss for 9 to 12 months. They're going on rotation. So if you get a bad boss, you suck it up for 9 to 12, and they're the ones who are going to be going. In other organizations, I've had friends that were in Reuters and others where, the boss coming on top of you is 3, 4, 5 years older. They're going to be there for 5 to 10 years, and now you've got a ceiling. So again, there's no right answer except context. But at some point, I think it comes back down to a few lessons that I learned. One of them is, why was I reacting the way I did? And at that time, I wasn't conscious of it at all. And I chose to be a dick. Not necessarily the right thing, but at some point, there was a learning opportunity. And I had realized as well that I had had so much good mentorship, but that I used it as a crutch because I took it for granted that it'd be there. And then all of a sudden, I didn't feel supported, and now I was acting out. So in a lot of cases, is that his problem or my problem? And I realized years later that I learned more from having bad bosses than actually good bosses. So we're down to the half cup kind of analogy of empty or full. And this is where I realized there's a lot of times where I chose the half cup empty, where I could have looked at it differently and learned something at the time. It's fast forward, you'll learn it later. Great. It's better. And I think that's what this whole element of mindfulness is at some point, the distance between the learning starts doing this, because you're more conscious for those little signals. And that's the opportunity to make a better decision. It doesn't mean you will. There's situations where I'll act out, and the next day, instead of 3 years later, I go, oh shit, I handled that one wrong. Or I could have handled it differently. Or, hey, you know what? I was actually responsible for picking a fight with my boss and ruining the relationship. So sometimes I think we point the finger at others when we're 50% responsible at least for the communication, the tone, the culture. We talk about culture, but my DNA is in my team culture. I'm responsible for that. And I think that's where the assessment is it a lost cause? So are you going against nature? Or are you just in a temporary situation where, something will move on? And again, so my answer is very situational because each situation is very unique, but these are the kinds of reflections that I would coach somebody through. And I frequently get calls like that for people, friends and others who know me, and I'll take 15 minutes for a virtual coffee and say, okay, spit it out and get the person thinking around some of these things. Have you thought of this? And again, it comes back down to decision quality, but also knowing what am I responsible for as well in that system for that quality relationship, and realizing that oftentimes, like I said, I was antagonist in that situation where I could have probably had a much better relationship with the individual if I hadn't been so much in reaction to some of the things that were irritating me, but that was my irritations, not him. And so we get back to mindfulness, and we get back to getting a better sense of who we are. And that puts us in a, again, not perfect, but maybe a better, more often making better decisions and choices over time.
Thank you. I think maybe that is, unless people have questions or comments, that's a good note to end on. And do you have your, in your thing, do you have your contact information in case anybody wants to reach out to you for further coaching, or are you available for one-on-one type things? Contact, there we are.
Yeah, I deal mostly with leadership teams. So I don't do a lot of one-on-one coaching, but I have also a group of people who are phenomenal in doing one-on-one. I do some, but how can I say, where I perform the best is usually when we're dealing with functional groups and teams or C-suites trying to restructure, and I don't say that in a negative way, are trying to get from point A to point B. So usually it's leadership teams, which involves individuals. And at the end of the day, it's usually just a referral network, depending on what individuals need, if it's more personal. So I tend to look at it more as an organization process, more than an individual coaching practice in my own. But these are my contact information: msalmon@lumosinc.com, with the number that's there if people are looking to get hold of me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, and merci beaucoup. And thanks to everybody who stayed to the end and asked good questions. And I hope to see all of you folks at our other events. And Michelle, you're very welcome to join us. We're having a pub quiz on Friday, and we're going to take questions from various presentations. So we will pick out some of your words of wisdom that are going to be in the pub quiz. So everybody who is here will have an advantage at answering some of the questions.